Welcome to the Brain Architects. I'm Rebecca Hansen, Senior Director of Communications at the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University. Our center believes that advances in the science of child development provide a powerful source of new ideas that can improve outcomes for children and their caregivers. By sharing the latest science from the field, we hope to help you make that science actionable and apply it in your own work in ways that can increase your impact. In July, as part of our ongoing webinar series, we hosted a live conversation exploring the impact of extreme heat on young children. The discussion included evidence-based strategies to protect young children and their caregivers when temperatures rise, and actionable solutions to help cool the places where children live, grow, play, and learn. The conversation was hosted by the center's Chief Science Officer, Dr. Lindsey Burghardt, and featured Michelle Kang, Chief Executive Officer of the National Association for the Education of Young Children, and Dr. Jennifer Vanos, Associate Professor in the School of Sustainability and the College of Global Futures at Arizona State University. We hope you enjoy listening, and please remember to subscribe to the Brain Architects on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to be notified of future episodes. Without further ado, here's Dr. Burghardt.
Our conversation today is going to focus on extreme heat and how it's affecting development, but we really want to emphasize strategies and solutions that can support young kids and their caregivers. So extreme heat is really one of the most dangerous, but also really one of the least recognized threats to healthy development. And we hear a lot in public policy circles, in the news, in the media, how heat is affecting older people and sort of all of us as a general population. And that's really important to talk about. But also pregnancy and really early childhood, infancy, these are times when people are really especially sensitive to the effects of extreme heat. And exposure to extreme heat, particularly during these sensitive periods of development, it's tied to really important outcomes. So things like premature birth, so being born before about 37 weeks gestation, low birth weight, being born too small, disruptions in children's sleep and learning, and really importantly, negative effects on their mental health, although there's many more. And so these outcomes are really, really important for us to understand because they have immediate effects in childhood, but they also really importantly have the ability to have effects and impacts across children's lifetimes. And so this makes intervention, especially what we're going to talk about today a lot, proactive planning to protect them, just so important. And the really good news here is that there are practical, actionable solutions that we're going to get into to either prevent or decrease the effects of extreme heat on kids. And there's communities that are already implementing these solutions with really good effect. So there are greening schoolyards in Los Angeles. There are citywide planning efforts happening here in Boston. So there's local action can happen, and it is happening, and it can really make an impact. So today we're going to talk about and learn more about what's working and how, if you're listening in, you can adapt what's happening to your context and expand these approaches if you're interested. So Michelle and Jenny, I'm so excited that you're here today. You're two obviously very different voices in the field with different backgrounds, but I think we're going to have a great conversation today. So Michelle, can we start with you and just have you kick it off by briefly introducing yourself and sharing with us sort of how you became connected to this climate-focused work?
Great. Well, thank you, Lindsey. And it's so great to be here with you and with Jenny. And I'm looking forward to today's discussion and welcome to all of you who have joined us for this important discussion. I'm Michelle Kang, and it's my honor to lead the National Association for the Education of Young Children, or NAEYC, or NAEYC. We are soon to be 100 years old, and we're the world's largest professional membership organization for early childhood education. We're focused on all things related to giving our youngest children a safe, healthy, developmentally appropriate education from the start. So understanding what's happening to our climate and the impact on children is critical. We know, as you've mentioned, Lindsey, that children can't learn and thrive if they are suffering in the heat. And the impact of global climate change and disastrous weather events not only interrupts learning, but also impacts the health, safety, and physical and mental well-being of children and families and educators everywhere. Our role is to support those children and the adults who care for them. And we have heard, unfortunately, with increasing frequency over the past few years, that these are not just hypotheticals anymore. Our members are grappling on a daily basis with how to deal with the changing climate. And they have been asking us for support and resources. In fact, we did a workforce survey earlier this year. We've been doing these periodically over the course of a year. And in our January survey, we had 45% of our respondents report that they have impacts from at least one weather-related challenge, including extreme heat, extreme cold, extreme wind, severe storms, wildfires, flooding, or poor air quality. Natural disasters can displace or shut down facilities and cause prolonged operational disruptions in service and instability for children and families who rely on these programs. And this impacts all types of early learning programs, schools, centers, family childcare homes. To inform our own thinking and approach, last year we had the chance to work with the Harvard Graduate School of Education to analyze how the changing climate affects quality and developmentally appropriate learning practices. And we had multiple listening sessions with our members and had a curated track of programming at our annual meeting last year. And in recognizing that the challenges and solutions are bigger than any one organization, I've been delighted to serve on the country's first early years climate action task force that had a number of recommendations out of its time together. Last summer, our organization interviewed and convened more than 20 nationally focused early ed, health, and climate organizations to better understand our respective priorities and approaches and to begin to explore how we might be able to collaborate. And we are looking forward to continuing to elevate this critical issue through our publications and convenings. I'm happy to share that this fall, our journal, Young Children, is going to be focused on research related to climate and early childhood. And our board felt strongly that this is an issue that we should undertake in providing a statement and guidance. So we will be working on the creation of the first ever position statement on climate and early childhood education. These statements are critical because they build understanding and support for quality early learning, and they reflect our mission and vision and our commitment to leadership and innovation and serving as a guidepost for our work and broader field collaboration, resources, policy, and practice. And I'll just say on a personal note, this issue is critically important to me as a mom. When I look ahead at what my children are going to be living through and inherit as a world, I can't imagine the world that they will be living in 10, 15 years from now when it's already, as you mentioned earlier today, so hot already where we all are. I'm, calling in from Maryland, and it's really warm outside and it's a challenging environment. And I hope that there are things that we all can do today to continue to think about how we might be able to address this for future generations.
Thanks, Michelle. You're such a clear and compelling voice in this field. And I feel like we're just so lucky to have you kind of advocating and leading a lot of this work. And one thing that you said about, these systems and places where young children learn can be so disrupted by climate, like that sense of stability and loss of stability is just so disruptive. And I think it interconnects so tightly to other parts of children's lives. Like if you can't go to your early learning environment, what does that then do to what type of day your parent has and how they're able to show up for their work and then how they're able to show up for your basic services. So it's so cascading, I guess, and interconnected in a way. And maybe the flip side of that, is a good news that if we could think about how to make these places where young children learn sources of stability, that actually we could prevent that cascading instability that could follow. So hopefully we can get into that a bit later in our conversation, but thank you for those opening thoughts. So Jenny, I'll turn it to you. Can you introduce yourself to our audience and tell us a little bit more about your work, especially as it's relating to strategies that are thinking about how we can reduce the impact of heat on kids and families?
Yeah, for sure. And thank you so much, Michelle, for your opening remarks. I'm really inspired by all of the work that you're doing. A lot of my work started really thinking about generally the impacts of heat on people, but then how we can mitigate heat through design, especially in urban areas. And just after I finished my PhD, we kind of had this realization, like nobody's really thinking about children's environments and how hot they're getting, and that these playgrounds we design can end up being these miniature heat islands or a heat islet within an urban heat island. And we started to explore that for kids at a very small scale, to the touch scale, saying, how hot are these surfaces getting? And what does that mean for the potential to burn your skin? And that is actually where I started on the children's problem. That's then from that scale really expanded into, how do we design our play spaces? What are the guidelines and policies that schools are using for looking outdoors and indoors and on learning and behavior and heat illness and prevention? And really understanding the intersections amongst different types of schools and parents and teachers and children, and what is known in this space and what are people doing about it. And not just at schools, we work on public spaces as well, and how can we protect children and youth athletes as well. But yeah, a lot of this began just at that touch scale, trying to understand what's going on at the surface temperature. And then, of course, we do a lot of work then on what's the influence of different types of shading strategies in playgrounds and across different climate zones. So even some of my work in Canada, looking at how can we design for different seasons, also acknowledging that extreme heat is becoming a larger problem. But I often start here today and say, what can we do today to support our children now that will also make really important impacts in the future, because we're adapting now. So we have to be doing things today so that we can have better adaptive strategies that support students in the future, that can also support some of the climate mitigation activities that we'd like to see that Michelle was discussing. And then the last thing I'll say is it's always apparent, one, the role that schools play in having that stable environment for children. And even for some children, it is going to be the coolest space they go to all day, depending on, the state or city you live in. And then just acknowledging that when you tackle some of the heat challenges in a school or schoolyard, it will automatically tackle some of the other challenges we might face from the climate system, such as flooding, right? If you remove impermeable surfaces and put in nature-based surfaces, you're going to help tackle some of the flooding challenges as well. So I'll kind of leave that out there as something we can discuss more later today.
No, that's great. And, I give you a lot of credit for being one of I feel like the really early people in this space, where when I started to learn about extreme heat and I look back now, the stuff I was reading, even before I connected with you, you did a lot of, I think, foundational work that really has increased our understanding about what we can do to keep kids safe. So I'm really lucky to be here with both of you guys today. And Jenny, if we can kind of get into the nitty gritty for a second, some of I think my favorite research of yours to read is the stuff that you do on how actually our bodies respond to heat on a cellular level, what happens inside us, what happens to our systems, right? And so if you don't mind, could you kind of walk us through what's actually happening inside the body when somebody's exposed to these really high temperatures, but kind of zoning out, how is that different if you're a really tiny toddler versus somebody who might be an adult or a pregnant adult? And how is that different, and why is it important for us to think about?
Yeah, sure. And I'll try and kind of stick to the example for kids, because it is very different as you get into aging population or someone who has a pre-existing condition. We all kind of have experienced what it feels like to be overexposed to high temperatures, especially when that coincides with high levels of radiation and high humidity and low wind speed. And it feels awful. And for kids, a lot of times, the first thing I think about before we get into the physiology is kids haven't always experienced these feelings before, so they don't always know what they're experiencing and what to do. So there's a lot that can be done in teaching kids. What are you feeling in terms of their own physical thermal comfort, and teaching kids some of that is really important. Even, I think about my toddler who's 3 and talking to him about the heat, and we have this cute podcast about the weather that gets into the heat. And it's really amazing that he knows when he's too hot, and he can tell me that. And it's really important to get that communication with your kids. And then even my 1-year-old will touch the ground and say hot already, which is really funny, but also great. But then when you get into the physiology, you're exposed to this heat, and we can say, okay, we're under stressful conditions. heat stress might be occurring. That doesn't mean that anything bad is yet occurring in the body, but it's an important indication that, yes, I'm feeling uncomfortable and I need to change what I'm doing. And most adults can do that really well. A lot of kids, especially if they're playing, want to keep playing. And so then you have this additional intrinsic motivation to account for the same thing you might see in an athlete or an outdoor worker, where even though they're feeling uncomfortable because of the heat, they're going to keep going. They're going to keep playing. And so then what can happen if we don't stop that soon enough is you'll start to see the rise in the rise in the heart rate, because we're trying to pump blood to the skin to lose heat from the body. And then you'll also start to see rise in sweat rate. Kids have less sweat glands. They sweat less than an adult would. And sweating is our number one way to lose heat when it's hot out. And so if we're not sweating as much, then we actually, kids can lose less heat than adults. And so that's one difference with adults. They also have a higher surface area to body mass ratio. So when it is really hot out, thinking when the air temperature is higher than our skin temperature, they can gain heat quicker as well. And so that's the second difference physiologically. And so when you see these things happening, you're going to start to then see a rise in core temperature. And that rise in core temperature is what's the most dangerous. And if you see that rise, above 104 degrees Fahrenheit or so, or higher, that's when you can get into this very high risk of heat stroke occurring, or if you're playing, it's more exertional heat stroke or a heat exhaustion. You really don't want it to get to that point. And that's when you can start to have these kind of very bad things happen in the body, in terms of, I don't want to get too wordy here, but you can start to leak toxins from your gut because it'll lose its integrity. That can lead to a cascade of impacts in the body that can cause multi-organ failure. And so that can happen very quickly if we miss the signs of what's happening in the kid's body. But along this kind of continuum I've been mentioning, so from just being a healthy child to hitting that state of potential heat stroke and ending up in the hospital, there's a lot that occurs that I think we've already mentioned today that precipitates things around poor learning, poor sleep, poor behavior, just poor mood overall, that also need to be addressed. And I always think about this pathway from heat stress all the way to heat strain and heat stroke, as we have to figure out the intervention points there. And what are they? And how can we keep kids safe and acknowledge that one child is very different from another child, and we have to know also which kids have potential pre-existing factors to account for certain medications, certain illnesses that they might have that make them higher risk than the average child. Because in general, kids are very healthy and can handle the heat better than someone like an older adult who is not able to sweat as much, and you have all these other thermoregulatory impairments that come along with age.
And I heard you say before, actually, like heat's a deeply personal issue, right? Like we don't all experience it the same. And I heard you also mention humidity, and I think that that's something that we're feeling a lot in Boston right now. But how do you think about when you see, say, a heat alert go out? Like it's going to be really hot in Boston for the next couple of days, and we get warned about the temperature is going to be over a certain point, and then you have that temperature being shared as one measure of risk. And then you also hear about things like heat index. So how do you interpret things like the number on the thermometer versus humidity and surface temperature and personal risk factors? Like, what do we need to think about and consider when we're making assessments for like what's safe for the kids in front of us and how we interpret all these different data points?
Right. It's such a great question. When I think about these heat warnings that are going out across the city, those are so important for enacting resources to get them in place for protecting vulnerable populations. So it might be opening cooling centers. It might be what's allowing the school to get extra resources to get water and keep kids inside, or really depends on the city, to be honest, when it comes to these heat warnings and what they enact. In Phoenix, a heat warning enacts so many things across the city, from fire and water and emergency preparedness and police support and closing trails. And it's going to look a lot different in terms of what a heat warning enacts in Boston, but I do know here that when there's a heat warning, then the school heat alerts go out, and any school that signed up for that can then get additional guidance on what to do. But it does really come down to an individual school and what is their environment like? What are their indoor conditions like? What are their outdoor conditions like? Some schools have really great shaded designs that are still okay to be playing in under slightly hotter weather. And I think it's important to acknowledge that as an important adaptive strategy for heat. And some schools can handle it better than others. And then some schools have gymnasiums and some schools don't. So that's another factor that comes into play as well. But in the end, in Boston, you're going to have that high humidity and a heat index that's much higher than the air temperature. In Phoenix, we don't have that. So we don't even use the heat index. We just use the air temperature, and that's what's enacting something into play. And I have heard that I know in Washington, D.C., I saw something today that says it's been the most humid summer on record so far. And it sounds so oppressive, and that humidity is very dangerous because you stop sweating efficiently, meaning you're evaporating sweat from your skin. Instead, you're dripping that sweat off. And that's when it can become the most dangerous, when you have high temperatures, high humidity, low wind flow, and then especially if you don't have a way to kind of get out of that situation.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And it's like when you think about, these schools being kind of sort of different localized environments too, and being better or less able to adapt to heat, it also, I think, informs like where the investments are needed, right? Like where do we need to target, investment, being more resilient against heat. And, Michelle, Jenny just mentioned, in like sort of that cascade of that arc in between like exposure to heat and heat stroke, that in the middle, there's these really important, outcomes like learning loss and absenteeism. And Michelle, I know you have this really direct view of early childhood systems nationwide. So how, and you mentioned the survey you did of your providers and people in your network. So how is extreme heat showing up for early educators right now? And how is it kind of affecting the programs that you're working with?
Yeah. So I'm going to build on so many things that Jenny just highlighted, but, as I mentioned, our workforce survey brought it that nearly half of them are experiencing some sort of challenges related to the changing climate. And I'll take it down to the level of the individual program, because one of the best things I get to do is to visit programs all over the country and see the magic that happens in early learning environments, in all different places. And I visited a program last year where I have been starting to ask a little bit about like what are some of the impacts. And one of them shared that they used to have this beautiful shade tree in the back that was part of their playground environment. It added to the natural learning environment. It provided shade. It was a major fixture of what their early learning program would be able to utilize for outdoor learning. And then they had a major storm, one of those storms that they said, oh, we haven't had a storm like this in decades. And unfortunately, I feel like we're hearing a lot more of that in today's world. But they lost their shade tree. And it happened to be the only source of shade that they had on their playground. And so it fundamentally actually changed how they had to do their days, because ideally you're able to take children out at times to have that gross motor play, that important time where you're able to get those zoomies out, especially important for the little ones who have lots of energy. But if you don't have adequate shade, if there is no other shade structure, and it's hot and getting hotter, then you actually can't take your children outside. And so it changes what the learning environment looks like for the day-to-day. It creates more stress on educators to ensure that they have to keep their children safe, so they're not going outside at the times that they would like to be able to have, again, that time for their bodies to move. And it increases that time that you're spending indoors, which, if you have adequate indoor environment and maybe that you have a choice of a space, you can still have that. But a lot of early learning environments don't have that option. They're highly dependent either on using a public space or being able to go outside. And if your outdoor environment is no longer hospitable to be able to handle the heat, especially in summertime, and provide that quality early learning environment, it means increased pressure on the educators, and their well-being, and being able to provide the kind of quality learning and interactions that they want for the children. it increases the stress on children who want to be able to move their bodies and be able to go outside. And then the other piece of this, which is not often thought about, but is a real impact, is the impact to their budgets if their program is now having to run air conditioners and compressors all day long at a higher pressure because you need to be able to cool your space. And your program, depending on your program, your windows and doors may not be up to the challenge of insulating against that heat. Your building might be challenged. And so then it adds additional pressure on the really challenging budgets that our early learning programs are, managing to run. So it's not only on the children, it's on the budgets and then on the educators. And it's all a lot to balance, and it's now this added challenge with the climate related threats that are now showing up all across our country.
And I'd love to ask you a follow-up about that. I mean, I think at the center too, when we've learned about a lot of these issues, we've just seen how interconnected they all are, right? And it's not just heat, it's that heat's amplifying inequities that were already there when it comes to community infrastructure. And if you're a child care facility in a neighborhood that's really dense, that has less economic opportunity, I can imagine that that's going to drive further this unequal burden of conditions that families are already managing, and when they're coming, with lower incomes or from marginalized groups. And, the difference probably in the baseline prevalence of which of those programs are air conditioned to start with and which aren't. So, in your work with these educators, how are you seeing challenges from, differences in building infrastructure or inadequate cooling that's already in place or economic inequality intersecting with how these different programs are experiencing extreme heat?
Yes, you said it, Lindsey, which is that the impact of climate change is more severe in historically disadvantaged and under-resourced communities, and many of those have vulnerable populations with young children. The programs are already stretched thin in terms of resources, and they just don't have the ability to adapt as easily with upgrades to the infrastructure that's needed. So as we think about what we can be thinking about is first, just from a data standpoint, being able to track and understand how is heat in particular. And I know I think in Boston they're actually you've put heat sensors and heat trackers so that we can be driven by the data that is showing how it is disproportionately challenging certain communities. They already have less access to green space. They're sometimes in these flood-prone lower lying areas of a town or city. And it's the children who are being most impacted because their bodies, as we talked about, can't assimilate, and they have they're more vulnerable to the impacts of what we're seeing.
Mm-hmm. And it's, I think, further driving a lot of the disparities that are already there if you're learning in a hot environment. And we kind of consider, of course, the littlest learners still learners. A lot of this conversation, I think, happens in the school setting. And then I think hopefully what the audience that's here today can help to do is kind of bring this application to our littlest learners, who sometimes, we need to bring into the policy circles and conversations. So Jenny, when we're thinking about, talk about things not happening alone or in isolation, I've read some really interesting work from your group about heat and air pollution, particularly in people who are unhoused or experiencing homelessness. So can you talk a little bit about those intersecting effects and why it's so important and what it tells us about addressing these multiple environmental stressors together?
Yeah, we kind of tackled that challenge last summer in Phoenix, acknowledging that on a lot of the hottest days, we also have air pollution warnings. And in the summertime, that's usually ozone warnings. And a lot of past literature from the epidemiological space has demonstrated that there can be these interactive effects on health outcomes due to a combined heat and air pollution. So high heat, high air pollution can enhance, or I shouldn't say enhance, but cause more negative effects to the population, especially those with pre-existing conditions. And then we also know in talking to school nurses that asthma is a big problem. And in Phoenix, during the school year, particulate matter is our larger challenge throughout the winter. And then ozone is more in the warm season. And so in working with school nurses to understand that, and you just mentioned the whole tracking data is so important. they track the asthma stuff really well because the kids actually have to come to the office to take their inhaler. We don't see this connection to tracking heat cases. If a kid comes in and is sick, are they sure, or do they know if they can relate that to heat or not? And there's some ways to be able to do that and support them to do that with their system. But what I found is nurses are using a variety of methods to keep track of the different illnesses that they see come into their nurse's office every day. And then some schools don't even really have a nurse there every day, or they have a health aide on some days. So that's another point I wanted to really emphasize. But yeah, with heat and air pollution, we're starting to then track in different schoolyards across Phoenix, both temperatures and particulate matter concentrations at that level in a way that can be seen automatically by the school nurse, so they can see their on-site concentrations and see how that might relate to some of their cases, or help them be more prepared for cases of asthma attacks or needing inhaler, or kids missing class and so forth. And we know there's some connection there with heat as well, but that's kind of the impetus to get at these combined interactive effects between heat and air quality, is that we know that they can often go hand in hand on the hottest of days. And if you know you already have a kid with a pre-existing asthma issue, and it's a poor air quality day, poor heat day, then you might want to keep them inside.
Yeah, and I think asthma is such a great one to highlight because it starts, although you don't technically diagnose asthma until children are a little bit older, tiny little children who are in the early care settings as well can wheeze or have eczema or things that, we need to be aware of their breathing, especially heat alone. But heat on these air quality days, it makes me think about most of these children actually come into school and into the early care centers with plans for their asthma that the nurses have in place. And so how do we think about kind of tying this information into their action plans, and kind of another way to be proactive about this disease that is really one of the main drivers of absenteeism and illness among kids. So it's such a one that I'm so glad that you highlighted. So diving into our solution conversation a little bit, Michelle, let's go to you first. What do you think the big opportunities are for childcare programs or early education systems to become part of this solution?
I do love that we're going to be thinking about like how we can continue to think about how we can be solutioning, because this is, I find sometimes this can be a very weighty and exhausting issue to think about. And, it sometimes feels like we're all helpless. But, the thing that I would raise is that childcare educators are leaders in their communities. They live and work with them. They are intimately familiar with the needs of children. They are often the most trusted partners to parents in the care and development of young children. And we recently confirmed this information in a survey that we're going to be releasing shortly, that parents are just those trusted partners that work alongside, thinking about how we can best support children becoming their best selves. Childcare educators, they're resourceful, they're innovative, and they know how to manage on limited funds and on, razor thin margins on a daily basis. I would love for us to be thinking more about them as experts and included and prioritized in community discussions about climate resiliency and capacity. They can bring their stories, they can bring their data to the table, and they can also bring their ingenuity. And they're going to share, and they need funding that allows them to be creative and innovate ideas of how best to deal with climate change in the context of their own programs and communities. They're going to be able to elevate that they also know what is needed. It might be a window air conditioner, which might sound so simple, but is a need that some programs have. It might be a canopy to go onto a playground. They might need help thinking about forward planning in light of disasters that we would like to think are not going to happen, but might. It might be materials for a garden. It might not. It might be something that I haven't named today, but certainly that they are thinking of. And if I can think of a way that we can be forward thinking, it's about bringing early childhood educators and program leaders to the table to be able to share what they are seeing and where they see solutions, because they can offer what makes sense for the children and the families that they serve and the families that they work alongside.
And that makes so much sense because there's so many variabilities, right? In each of these environments, there's no two that are the same. So in terms of experiencing heat in a very localized and personal way, they're going to know obviously what's really best and most needed in their context. So Jenny, are there community-based interventions that you really want to highlight in terms of showing promise to protect kids from heat? If you can, I'd love for you to get a little bit into the Playground Shade Index, because I think that's a really fascinating thing for our audience to hear about.
But yeah, something like a tool like the Playground Shade Index, what it does is it allows us to kind of use these overhead maps to map out where trees are and look at changes, trees and shade. So Michelle just mentioned canopies as well. So thinking about shade sails or even shade from buildings, we can map that with our Playground Shade Index model, and we can look at the changes over time and say, how are conditions changing and hopefully improving, so that a school can quantify the presence of shade as the tree grows, as they put in more shade sails, to be able to show not just shade, but we can calculate their total exposure to UV rays. And at different times of day, where is that shade cast? So that they can also say, oh, this area is a place kids really like to play at this time of day. We could add shade there because right now it's a high UV exposure. We can add shade there to be cast at this time of day. So something like the Playground Shade Index tool allows us to do that, but we can do it anywhere too. We have a school that has put in a community path around their school for kids to use as part of their gym class and for the community to use as a walkway. And we started to then map out where those trees went, and we'll be able to see the change over time. And I think that something like this is also really helpful for a school to demonstrate their value to the community, to their kids. And also if they're looking for funding resources in the future to demonstrate their success. And that's what we're hoping for. Or a school that says, I really need trees or a shade canopy, and we can help them map out that maybe they have a really high UV or solar load on their schoolyard, and they can start to figure out where they want to add in the shade. And that can help with funding acquisition as well.
I jumped right into the index because I think it's so cool and exciting, but do you mind, can you zoom out to a little bit and just talk kind of broadly about why shade is so effective and why it's such an important cooling strategy? Because I think a lot of times there's sort of this overwhelm of like when you go online and you want to read about all the things you can do to make your environment cooler, there's different surfaces and there's, like all these different measures you can take. But I've heard you speak in really compelling ways about like how powerful shade is in terms of lowering temperature and why it's such an important strategy in and of itself.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's one of the most powerful tools in lowering your overall heat load. And I think every single one of us here knows that on a hot day, when it's sunny out, we're going to go find the shade. We're going to go to the side of the street that's shaded. We're going to go seek shade under those buildings. And by doing that, we're not lowering our air temperature exposure at all. We're lowering our what we call mean radiant temperature exposure, or your exposure to the sun. And by doing that, we're preventing sunlight and not just UV rays, but thinking about visible rays into the infrared being absorbed by the body that heats us up. So that radiant heat exposure is what we reduce when we add shade into our environments, when we seek shade. We're not reducing air temperature. And so that's one of the misconceptions we see all the time around how we can mitigate heat. And we're not lowering air temperature necessarily by adding in shade. Now, a tree can lower air temperature ever so slightly by its evapotranspiration, but it's not going to be more than like a degree or so. If you add in a bunch of trees and then water, then you get a much bigger cooling effect. But it really depends on where you're living and how you might be able to do that. Because in a place like Boston, you could also increase humidity. So you really have to be careful and balance these out. But overall, shade is always going to reduce your overall heat load. And it can be reduced by, in terms of a radiant temperature on the human body, by like 30 degrees Fahrenheit, which is really meaningful. And that's just an average. In a place like Phoenix, where it's extremely sunny and dry and hot, the shade can reduce your mean radiant temperature by much more than that. And so it is very powerful. And so we often say, shade the people, shade where people are. So with playgrounds, we know kids are using playgrounds for physical activity. The best thing we can do is provide them shade at the times of day that they're going to be using the playground. We don't want to be using strategies in a playground that's going to reflect even though those strategies have been kind of used in certain areas of the city by using something like a reflective pavement on a road to reflect sunlight back up into the sky. If we put that on a schoolyard, we're going to reflect the sunlight back up to a child. So it's much more important to block the radiation than to reflect it. And I really think that's an important thing to state here, especially knowing that the biggest detriment to that reflection occurs in the middle of the day, and that's when we have kids at schools.
Yeah, that's when recess is. And it's at the time of day where schools are let out and a lot of kids are playing outside as they're waiting for buses or being picked up. Now, Michelle, given all the work that you've done in childcare centers, Jenny highlighted some shade examples. Are there really good examples of programs you've seen that have helped to address heat or build resilience to heat, especially in these community center ways or driven by the early childcare educators that you spoke so highly of? Especially, I think people are thinking about, how do I do this, but I don't have a lot of funding?
Yeah. Well, first, I'm just going to say, Jenny, I have written down shade the people, shade where people are. I love that because it also speaks really well to early learning environments and what they need, and in this question of, examples of building resiliency, I think it is about how we can frankly, address the fact that early childhood programs need resources to be able to address shade structures, so that in light of the changing environment, that they have the ways to be able to shade the children and shade the educators who are working with them so that they can have that time outside. I'll share that earlier this year we had an opportunity to partner with LIF and National Community Development Financial Institution, a CDFI, to talk about elevating solutions out of challenges. And among them is local funding opportunities, identifying local funding opportunities to help programs buy shade structures and funding programs to have that essential shade element. Another piece that isn't always thought about, but I do see happening more, is recognition that early childhood programs are part of community infrastructure, and they need to be recognized when you think about emergency preparedness and response. So when you think about like these unavoidable happenings of storms or other events or high heat events, how can we help recognize the importance of early childhood programs, of also being prepared and taking the time and resources to support them in being able to be recognized in the community infrastructure. So that might be a community that is doing planning, thinking about including early childhood programs at the table alongside local health departments, environmental organizations, emergency services, so that we can get those programs and the vital care that they're providing up and running again quickly in light of disasters, that we're addressing resiliency. So whether it's, again, having preparedness plans, looking at, down to the operational detail of, how often are you updating your plans for evacuation, where the site is that you need to go beyond the fire drill where you go across the street or you are going next door. What is that thinking that we now need to be doing to make sure that our early childhood programs are prepared? We think about schools, but we don't always think about the family childcare program or the centers or the schools down the street. And there's been great examples now of communities recognizing childcare as essential infrastructure and including them as we think about how we can prepare children and families and utilizing the amazing programs and communities they create to be able to be prepared and to be thinking ahead so that we're not scrambling and having to react.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I think there just seems like there's such potential for early childhood centers to be like these stabilizing forces when everything else is destabilized. And the same with schools. And to what Jenny mentioned earlier, I imagine it's true of early childhood programs as well, that sometimes those might be the coolest places where children spend time all day. So how do we think about increasing that so that all children have a place that is a comfortable temperature, or that if there's a wildfire, that they could be clean air rooms, or sort of these sources of like places people are already going that are already familiar to children, where they're getting all of these essential inputs to their development. I think it's just like such a powerful opportunity there. So, and to your other point, like it takes bringing in, I think, people who do not consider themselves as like being early childhood people, you know, but when they come to the table and like increase this infrastructure interconnectedness, I think there's just a lot of potential for everybody to win and everybody to thrive. So
Yeah.
that's terrific. Jenny, I want to make sure that we save a few minutes for you to talk about Heat Ready Schools, because you really led the development of this program. And I think it's an amazing example of a community-centered response to heat. So do you mind sharing more about it and how it's being used to protect kids and staff and caregivers from extreme heat?
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much. We really love our Heat Ready Schools program, and I'm excited I get to share more about it. But around 2019, we had a really ambitious graduate student here who wanted to tackle heat ready at schools. And we were working on heat ready city initiatives. And we decided that we would figure out with schools and with school community members, like Michelle was saying, as the experts. We brought them to the table. We did some focus groups with them. And we learned what were the most important factors within their school that can be addressed to mitigate the impacts of heat. And so the way we ended up defining a heat ready school is those that are increasingly able to identify, prepare for, mitigate, track, and respond to the negative impacts of schoolyard heat. And so that evolved into developing these themes of environment and policy and education and so forth, that then we can make recommendations saying, and this is again based on developing this with school community input over about a year process focused on Phoenix schools, to be able to say what's important to them, make these recommendations, and allow schools to then be able to figure out what can they tackle this year. Is getting heat illness training for their teachers and nurses and coaches in place, is that the most important thing to tackle? Okay, we can help them with that. Is getting shade for their schoolyard the most important thing they want to tackle this year? Okay, well, we can try and hook them up with this Canopy for Kids grant funding that the city of Phoenix has, or we can help them try to get a shade sale and so forth. Or it might be able to like figuring out, can they get a health aid in on some days of the week, or start tracking heat illnesses at their school? So the Heat Ready program is designed to be able to be flexible and tailored towards the school. And we can provide these recommendations that are the kind of set of guidelines, but they decide what they are already doing, because a lot of schools are already doing these things. We just don't realize it. And it's nice for them to say, no, we do that already. We check that box. And to see how they're doing. And then also notice, oh, we haven't thought about that. We don't know which kids are the most at risk or which might be on certain medications. Like I recently learned that ADHD medication can make kids at more risk for having heat illness. And so understanding who's the most important to be keeping safe during the heat is important. The last thing we've just started to incorporate into this is physical activity. And one thing throughout all of my work in this area of heat and kids in schools is that I'm always cognizant of the fact that it sounds like we're saying, don't let the kids outside. And we're not saying that. We're saying, figure out ways that you can safely allow the kids to still get outside and play, whether that's changing the recess time, changing the environment, changing where they're allowed to play outside, and figuring out ways to make it safe. Because the last thing I would want is for kids to not be able to go outside. But I also acknowledge that some days it's just so hot they cannot go outside. It's not safe. And so then with that being said, what are other ways they can get physical activity indoors? And we've developed some guidelines here. Then what are activities you can do in the class with the kids? If you have a gymnasium, what can you do in the gymnasium? Maybe you can use the hallways at certain times of day. And then we also have kids in our school district right in Tempe, Arizona, going to school in the middle of July. So the school year is also changing. And that's the hottest time. They're going to go to school when it's 115-degree air temperature outside. So we really have to figure out ways to still allow kids to get their physical activity. And so it's not just heat that's changing, it's our exposure patterns to heat that's changing. And by adding exposure, higher exposure, then that can result in overexposure. So a little bit of exposure to heat, not bad. Overexposure to heat, bad. And that's what we need to figure out, what that overexposure is for kids.
Well, I got so excited about our conversation that I didn't leave a lot of time for questions, but I guess in the last minute or two, there's one that sort of bubbled up beyond the others is being asked quite frequently. So I'll pose it to Michelle first in terms of how you've seen, I love what did you say earlier, like early childhood educators are like so creative that they can operate on these razor thin margins. Like what strategies, both in early care and then we'll say in schools too, can people do like today if kids are going back to school and there's not air conditioning inside? So how do we cool classrooms? Like what can we do in the moment? And if you haven't seen anything or, you want to deflect it back, that's okay too. But maybe just one thing you could think of. Somebody wanted to address this tomorrow in their setting. Michelle, I'll take it to you first.
Well, I want to take it actually a level up on that as opposed to that specific thing, but just elevate one thing before in this conversation, which is all of what we've talked about and what the system needs is money and resources. Yeah. We need resources to address these issues. The investment has to come from somewhere. Ideally, we would recognize as a country that childcare is infrastructure for this country. And so there wouldn't even be this question of why we would have a program that doesn't have an air conditioner to address the heat, because we would recognize and invest in the fact that we should be helping our children thrive. And we should provide the environments and support to do so. There is a lot of momentum at the state and local level to address, how we are addressing the impact of climate, on early childhood programs. But I would like there to not even be a question of an early childhood program that doesn't have, or a school that doesn't have a way to address the heat, because we've already recognized how vitally important they are for thriving communities and for a thriving country. So I will leave at that. I know that might not be a satisfactory answer for anyone who raised that question. I would say that on that note, elevate it to your policymakers, elevate it to leadership. And, we should, find ways to keep children safe that doesn't put it on the backs of schools. Yeah. Have to figure it out.
Agree. Jenny, what would you add for any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to amplify that statement, though. A lot of what we're careful about is that what we're trying to do with Heat Ready, we don't want to make it an additional burden and make it something that helps them out on a day-to-day basis in terms of managing the learning environment. And Michelle also makes a good point that, air conditioning or just having a cooler environment, it doesn't always have to be air conditioning. It really depends on your climate, but having a thermally appropriate environment for learning and safe learning is really important. And I often think about this comparison between how we heat our schools in the winter and air conditioning. Often air conditioning is looked at as like a bad thing, but we don't look at heat as a bad thing. And we keep our schools a certain temperature in the winter so that kids are able to learn and be safe. And I think we can try to, as a country, be thinking about heat that way. At what temperature can kids be kept safe and able to learn and do what they're doing? In Arizona, we do have a state law that says that all schools' indoor environments must be kept below 84 degrees Fahrenheit. I know that still sounds a little hot, but it's still much cooler than the 110 degrees outside, and every school has to do that by law. Some of the coolest temperatures kids will be exposed to all day are at the school. It's a really protective place. And the schools here in Arizona are not going to close on a heat day. When I lived in San Diego, schools would close on a heat day. So then what are the repercussions then for the parents' day? And then is the child going home to a house that's also not cooled? Yeah. And heat is so dangerous. We're talking about this. Heat it can impact the body much quicker than cold can impact the body as well. And so I think we need to be acknowledging the fact that we can look at heat and cold similarly, but the budgets don't look that way, at the federal level. We really put a lot more money to heating spaces to keep people safe than to cooling spaces to keep people safe.
It is. And I think it's one where like the investment hasn't caught up with the science, right? Where we know this information. So we're lucky to have people like the two of you that are getting this messaging out there and increasing awareness. And I know that our audience will go out and do the same. So thank you both so much for being here. This was a terrific discussion. We're so grateful for your time and the time of everybody who joined. I'm going to pop it back over to Rebecca for more and some closing remarks.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Brain Architects. Be sure to check out the Center on the Developing Child's website at developingchild.harvard.edu, where you can find links to our social channels, sign up for our newsletter, and learn more about the impact of extreme heat on early childhood development. You can also explore a range of topics related to early childhood, from toxic stress to the importance of the developmental environment, and much more. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.